Welcome to the fourth installment of Artists About Artists, which is sponsored and represented by Susan Eley Fine Art in New York, and also Susan Eley Fine Art in Hudson, upstate New York. And we are conducting interviews, gallery artists, interviewing gallery artists, and exchanging our views. And I'm very happy to have James Isherwood with me today. I may introduce myself first. I'm Karin Bruckner. I'm a former architect turned printmaking artist, mixed media artist, and I found it very serendipitous to be an architect interviewing James about his paintings because I've known you since 2012, since I came to the gallery first, and I was immediately drawn to your paintings because they had a lot of architectural structures in them, buildings and elements and, pieces, objects. And I've learned since that I probably wasn't the only one who thought that maybe James is an architect, or maybe James is a member of the professional field, only to find out later that is not the case. But that is definitely something that immediately drew me into your work. And I think later on, as we're talking about some of the individual pieces that we have here for everyone today, we can readdress that issue as to the elements that show up in your paintings and the how and the why. So welcome, James, and it's really nice to have you here today. And maybe first off, you want to say a few words about, your background, your career, how you got to be Susan Eley Fine Artist, the relationship. Take it away, James.
Thank you, Karin. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, and thank you for being here with me today. Yeah, my career started as a young child, making art since about the age of 3, all the way through college at Parsons School of Design, BFA in painting from Parsons. And after exiting school, which I was very glad to do, I was just ready to kind of make my own paintings. And career started very slowly, and I think my first real public show was in 1998 with a small work show at NYU's Gray Art Galleries. From there on, it was a very slow process, just kind of toiling away in the studio in Brooklyn and finding my way. And I was making a lot of abstract paintings that were process-based, and that changed in about 2007. To have more narrative works because I wasn't feeling satisfied with the work at that time, and I needed a change, and that also happened gradually. And about 2008, actually 2007, I joined Susan Eley Fine Art through a friend of mine, Jeffrey Rothstein, who's a photographer who had worked with Susie, and she went to see some work at his place in Chelsea, and she saw my work in the apartment and contacted me, and eventually we made a studio visit within a few weeks, and after she saw the work, she asked if I wanted to be represented by the gallery, and it was sort of a big shock and a surprise, and it makes you feel good as an artist who really wants to get their work out there more, and it's kind of evolved since then. We have a really great relationship with the gallery, and I'm so happy to be a part of Susan Eley Fine Art.
Yes, it's a very wonderful place to be a part of. And Susan has a great eye, and I'm not surprised that she immediately honed in on your work, and she knows what she likes and she goes for it. Awesome. So just a quick question, did you always want to do paintings, or were there other periods where you felt like maybe I want to do sculpture, or maybe I want to do drawings, or it's always been a painting thing?
There was experimentation in sculpture in school and ceramics, but painting was definitely a true love. Loved the material, loved making all kinds of paintings for many years. A lot of wall sculptures that were related to painting, sort of tapestries that were painted on canvas and then threaded to look like rugs that were attached to stretcher bars, and works like that, works that were kind of turning the substrate inside out.
Awesome, which is also kind of a process-oriented way of going about things.
Yeah.
So enough idle talk. I think I'm going to attempt to share my screen and share with everybody a number of paintings that you've sent me when I asked you for a selection of works that you wanted to talk about. So here I'm gonna go, sharing my screen. Here we are, and share. Can you see it?
Yes, there's
So I have 9 here, and I'm just going to do a quick, now the Zoom thing is getting in my way. I'm going to do, go away, a quick slideshow. Here we are, of all the ones. This one is called Tarn. And then here we have New Understanding, Isle, Waking Dream, Eastern Promise, Magnetic Midnight, Visitation, Coastal Stations, and Apparitions. So these are 9 works. I'm going to close this and go back to the overview. So I hope that one way or another we'll get to talk about each individual one. The first question I have for you, why did you choose those particular works, and are they or are they not in any way connected, related to each other? And are they more recent or older ones?
The choices made were for more recent works in the last 2 years. Tarn is the earliest, it's 2019 in this group of paintings. And then we go through 6 others that are from 2020 and 2 brand new works from 2021. They are a mix of works on panel and works on paper. Tarn is a 24-inch by 24-inch acrylic on panel. And it's a mountainscape about the process of a mountain building itself out of nature, and also about the process of snow and water melting to make a tarn, which is a glacial mountain lake that is formed in a hollow.
That was my next question. What is a tarn?
Yes. Yes, it is a glacial mountain lake that's formed after much melting and evaporation, and it's processed from the top to the bottom. And all the details of this painting are about that movement, that slow movement, and the monument of a mountain itself.
I want to go back to the title for a second, because going through some of your previous work, I actually hate the word older, because work is work and it doesn't lose its value just from the title and year that's assigned to it. We may be doing different things, but it's still, if they're good, and it doesn't matter what year they're from. But I've noticed in some of the timeline earlier works that there are titles like Hedger, Wedger, Bender, Receder, which are unusual to my ears. Can you speak a little bit about those titles?
Those titles were given as personas for each work. Something having to do with actual physicality in there. Hedger was a beachfront architectural home that I thought a hedge funder would have. It's kind of a cartoony painting. Wedger was a split architectural structure. And so the building in that particular painting was kind of crammed into that space. And gradually those titles faded away from the persona and then became a little bit more ephemeral and sometimes non-specific.
Oops, sorry. Here's the blooper. Yeah, so they just, it's interesting to hear them explained by you, because Hedger and the connection to hedge fund, I mean, there's a little smile built into this whole thing, which I like.
The works from the
But also
mid
like a construction thing in a way, you know, it's like it almost sounds like a tool specific expression of some tool that I don't know about yet, but it's intriguing.
those works in the early to mid 2000s were about a luxury real estate itself. I was interested in looking at these homes from a perspective where there were no humans present. And that is a large portion of the work, where architecture is present, but there is no human presence. That absence is a vein that interests me very much, about what happens to these places when no one is there. So they become very quiet or dreamlike, surreal pictures.
Yes, I think these are elements that we're gonna encounter in some of the next paintings too. So let's just go through them right now and then revisit some of those aspects after. So I'm going to go to the next one, which is called New Understanding. I'm just going to try and move this up a little bit if I can, and I'm lost in. All right, I can't move it, so let's go with it. Okay, New Understanding. This one is particularly intriguing to me for several reasons that I would like to revisit a little later as well.
Okay. This is a work on paper, 22 inches by 30 inches. A landscape that evolved from a purely linear, abstract, layered color background, and then was refined down to almost what is a plot of land in a mountainscape, kind of reminiscent of California, maybe Malibu, but still unreal. A floating architectural structure with many facets, windows to other times or spaces. Yet still no interior. We're still seeing reflections that possibly could allow us in. And there are things there that make sense or don't make sense. And there are subtle parts of the work that I want the viewer to slow down and really drink in the works.
Yeah, and the longer you spend looking at them, the more things you notice. And it occurred to me earlier today with another one I was looking at, and I'm noticing it for the first time again in this one, that the building is actually floating off the ground. It's not touching the ground. So I think there are many components here where it looks so familiar and it looks like things that we're looking at all the time. But then when you start looking closer, you start asking yourself, what is it that I'm actually really looking at? And what reality am I in? And then there's the reflecting pool and what the reflecting pool shows. More about that later. One thing I may want to bring in now, because as opposed to the first one we saw was a work on panel, and this one is a work on paper. And so these are the primary two substrates that you're using for your paintings. And when do you choose which one goes where? How does it influence the way you work with them? And does size play a role in these decisions?
I work on about anywhere between 15 and 20 works concurrently, all in various stages of evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times they'll feed off of each other. I consider the panels a different kind of painting than the works on paper, even though a lot of the subject matter may be related, but the substrates themselves offer different problems for me to solve. Panels are very flat without texture. I use a lot of fluid paint on them, and they're much more labor intensive. I can't be as free with the control I like to bring into the paintings as much as I can on paper. The paper gives me a little bit more versatility of absorption of the liquid paint, and then the ability to layer on very clean backgrounds. So it's an interesting back and forth. I find myself working on works on paper for a while as a concentration, and then switching to panel. But these things rotate as, you know, success and failure evolve in each work.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned the 15 paintings, individual things that you work on at the same time, because I think a lot of it varies. Some artists concentrate on one specific work that they're working on, whereas, you know, you, or to a certain extent I do the same. It's if you're working with a certain color or movement or texture, it's interesting to see it migrate from one thing to the next if you have several things in process at once. And, you know, every time you apply an element somewhere, you learn something about it that you then can test on another one and see if it does the same thing there or it does different things. And texture to me is a really important part of your work, to see how you create all these different areas of flat versus, you know, wash versus textured. And it's a very interesting thing for me to see how you resolve the delineation versus the transition from one to the other. And it really feeds into this narrative of reality versus non-reality. And that also makes me think, do you plan out your work before you started? Are there sketches? Do you transfer the sketches to the panels of paper, or do you just get started at a point and take it from there?
I get started at a very loose point of fluid paint, or on the works on paper, the paper sheet is saturated, and then I begin activating the surface with one color, maybe two, maybe three, maybe four, to bring about an image. And that's a very rough image, usually landscape based, of a horizon line or something a little bit more. I try to fill up the space. And then gradually the layers come in. I use a lot of photography as reference for architecture and landscape, and other elements of design, furniture, colors of interiors, of homes and apartments, and all of those things become hybridized within my brain, and then I filter them out as the pictures start to become more complex.
Yeah, I remember you telling me at some point that you refer to real estate magazines or interior magazines to call out some of the elements that might be working for the particular things you are having in process at that moment.
Yes, it's mostly a lot of like trying to I find architectural structures that strike me. You know when you quote like something, and then I put that in a file, and with similar files as far as landscape is concerned, and then I begin to chop up and marry them, not in a Photoshop way or in a sketch way, but just as images. And then usually the landscape starts to come together as the work progresses, and that's both on panel and on paper. And the architectural structure makes its way in maybe halfway, 50% of the time of the completion of the work, and sometimes even much later, because I'm trying to find the proportion of that piece of architecture or pieces of architecture. Sometimes there's more than one. And how do I make them work? And they are, when I find the proper building, then I'll take pieces of it and marry it with other buildings, and then I trace that drawing of those things that were chopped up, and then I will transfer that onto a work on paper or panel via tracing paper, double-sided. And I also sometimes I reuse pieces of those structures in other works. So it could be a smaller work, it could be a larger work, it could be a back piece that goes into the background of a work. And it's another way to activate the space, even though it may disappear until the final.
Sounds to me almost like it's a little bit of an unplanned way of going about things. So you're not sitting down and starting to draw something on the canvas, but you start researching and collecting first, and then eventually the pieces come together, and eventually they might find themselves in one of your paintings, or maybe there, or even get lost in the paintings. But that's a very interesting way. It's almost like a mind collage in a way.
Yes, it's a challenge. I'm looking to push myself and the work forward, to make it more complicated and magnetic, hopefully, for the viewer, to draw them in and to have them explore what the heck is going on in some of these things.
Yes, that's a good question. Let's just keep going, because there's so much to talk about with your paintings, and then we don't have enough time to share with everybody. So let's go to this next one here. This has a very washy feel to it. Is that a work on paper?
It is a work on paper. And that's how that background starts out that we were talking about just a few minutes ago. Is wetness, letting it dry, and then proceeding on. The horizon line was not there. As far as you could see this mountain landscape in the deep back. That was the last thing I put on this painting, that purple horizon line. Everything developed from the washy background you see. The architectural structure was then made and painted in its entirety there. Then the trees were added, and then the rock that's at the ocean. This is a home that is right on the water. Those rocks were sort of almost the very last thing before the horizon line added to this particular piece. And this is a particularly quiet work for me. The house almost contemplating nature itself. It's placed there. It's
very serene. But it's interesting you mentioned how you put the mountainscape in at the end, because it anchors the whole thing. And when I'm looking at it right now, it's interesting to me that the part of the sky almost imitates the shape of a mountainscape. This one is a bit more intense.
Waking Dreams. This is a smaller work on paper, 15 by 20-ish inches. This took a long time to make, probably almost 9 months to make this work, to make things come together. And I really wanted to make something more dreamlike and fantastic, yet still have real elements of nature with the starry sky. And then these hyper real sort of fall colors and spring colors with foliage, and the focus of these two pieces of architecture kind of also again on a plot of land with a pool that just, it kind of radiates a little bit. I had so much fun making the pool reflection in this piece, which I think it's just this contrast to the very sharp and flat surroundings of it. And yet what would be the grass where that house and pool are seems to almost be the sky on fire. And that was a very exciting element for me to include in that as a complete contrast to the blues and greens of the quote natural sky and mountain and forest.
It balances it out in a very nice way, but I have to say the sky is just absolutely spectacular. The stars, and how long did that take you to make it? It looks like tiny little
They're very tiny. Yes, there's a couple different colors in there. I couldn't tell you exactly, but somewhere in the area of 30 to 40 hours just on the sky.
But I bet it's very meditative.
It can be, and frustrating.
But then it's no longer meditative. when it gets to be frustrating. Yeah, the reflecting pools are also something that is worth another notion, I think. Here we have another one, Eastern Promise, that is entirely focused on landscape.
Yes. This is a 30 by 40 work on acrylic on panel. And this painting was motivated by Chinese painting of mountains, kind of where most of the elements come from. A lot of brushwork that's very sort of abstract expressionist in there, and layering, lots of layering of color, both opaque and transparent. A lot of very small, thin vertical lines that echo the height of this giant monument that is multiple mountains. Sort of tectonic plates also was part of the thinking of the way slowly the earth comes up into the sky. And the motivation was also to make this thing very tranquil, very pleasurable for the eye in both its transparency and opacity, to show the differences in how mountains can be seen, as we know, between night and day, twilight, and all the in-between. And I think this painting captures a good portion of those different kinds of time.
But I think as compared to the one we saw before, Isle, this is a lot less tranquil to me than the other one. And I think it has a lot to do with the colors. I find it very hard to just go through your work and not just talking about what's in it, because there's so much that comes out at you. And the hyper saturated color is something that I feel is a more recent development in your work. You've always had very saturated colors, but the palette was altogether a little bit more muted. And now we have like these really striking colors in there, the oranges, the reds, the fluorescence. Some later work, there's more and more fluorescence. I kind of wonder if that has something to do with the times. We live in alarming times, calls for alarming colors. But when I remember when I first saw this painting in the gallery, and it struck me as a real departure from work of yours, that not just in size, but also in the way you treat the paint and the areas, that the flat and the structured and the washes, because even though it's so intense and it seems so, you really feel the paint, there's a feel of melt and runniness to what comes across. And that is something that I hadn't really seen in earlier work of yours.
All the work has always been fluid, even back to very early days of post-college. So it's using all the tools in, the tool shed to make different things happen, and knowing the material, knowing yourself. And that's what I'm continually trying to explore, is mixing and matching these things to make better paintings.
But you also have a very keen interest and sense for applying texture, sometimes with unusual materials that bring the textures about, which it seems to be pushing the medium as far as you can possibly take it. So, but the deeply saturated colors are actually more energizing to me than calming, even though the landscape in and of itself is rather devoid of other distracting things. Not that it needs it, there's so much going on in this painting, but as you mentioned earlier, and we touched on in another painting, the absence of humans is very striking in both Eastern Promise and Tarn. Even more so than with the other things. It's almost, I want to go back to something you said earlier, which is that the elements you're putting in are personae of sorts, they're characters. So are they stand-ins for the human presence? Or you mentioned also, it's like, thinking about the presence of the absent.
Yes, it is about the presence of the absence, for sure. And they are stand-ins in a way for humanity. But they're placeholders, I think, for humanity, the needs of shelter. And I think they reflect certain aspects of humanity because of their strangeness and their offness of not being a photograph.
Right.
The color is its passion for the paint, and the way the works have evolved in the last few years of going fluorescent, such as Magnetic Midnight here, many layers of paint, has been a need to put more charge into the work, as a challenge and as, I guess, a discipline, trying to master these difficult colors and combine them and make it work and have them be magnetic, as in this picture's Aurora.
This one in particular is very striking, and it puts me, first of all, I think this is like a moment where, in my mind, your work takes off into space. And there is, it reminds me of Aurea Borealis, and the natural miracles that can take place in the sky. But it also puts me in some weird way, it brought me back to Stanley Kubrick's Space Odyssey 2001, because there's this one sequence where towards the end where you fly through space, and it's almost like a psychedelic, not being able to grasp anything that's going around you, but you're just inundated by speed and movement and color. And that's what these things do to me when I look at them. There's a cinematic effect, something psychedelic.
This work, the architecture is a vehicle in this work, for sure. It's floating, it's either arriving or departing. It's unclear which state it's about to be in, and
it's true, it could be hovering like a spaceship.
That aspect of it really appealed to me, with what's happening with the sky and its effect on the minimal amount of nature that we see there.
Well, and then, there are these 3 trees over there, either cypresses or not trees or whatever vegetation this may be. There's almost something threatening about those, unsettling, they're spiky.
Well, they're viewing a certain point of view of light as well. Something is happening to the right off of the picture that we can't really comprehend. We know it's light related, but what exactly is that? Right. It poses, I think, more questions than it gives as far as answers are concerned.
Well, yeah, I think you're helping us also with posing those questions, because there really is there is a surreal quality to your work. There is an unreal reality. Like I said earlier, it looks deceptively familiar. We know the woods, we know the houses, we know the trees, but then again, nothing. And then as an architect, of course, I'm looking at the building and I'm looking how things come together, or they don't come together. They don't meet in a way that structurally makes any sense. So it makes sense and it doesn't make sense. And the building is there and it's not there. It's not sitting, it's hovering. And the walls are, the walls in a lot of your structures become like portals into another world, which again brings me back into space. It's like we could be entering entirely different galaxies to the sides of the structures in your paintings, or the roof, like in New Understanding earlier, this one where we're leaving something behind here. That's the building opens up, it flips up. There's something Escher-esque about it, the way it unfolds, and you don't really know what's up and down and what connects to what. And then there's the flatness and the detailedness. There's a sky in there. So Are you inviting us to question reality, transcend reality, or maybe create our own? Is there an Isherwood world of symbolism somewhere?
Possibly, but not intentional. As far as a vocabulary that is written down and used as puzzle pieces to put something together. No, I think the pictures pose their own questions and most likely do not answer them clearly, but they allow you both in and both. They kind of push you away as well.
There's also the value to, actually, maybe there's even more value to the question than there is to the answer. Sometimes the question is more important than the answer we could possibly get from it. Just the fact that we're able to ask the question gets us to a different place.
Yes. This is a particular favorite. That's a 2020 painting on paper, 22 inches by 30 inches, called Visitation. And this has a very similar feel of presence and maybe a coming and going. And the title brings that out for us. And yet we're still unsure whether it's materializing or not. In a very serene, to me, serene yet very psychedelic world that's present. Almost touchable, but everything is still connected in puzzle pieces and in tiny details that reflect the atmosphere, the environment. It could be a certain time of day or night, and that is also unclear. And those elements, it's a good challenge for me to keep it a bit ambiguous. And to explore the details that are there. They're always interested in the micro and the macro. And I think that's evident in all the work as far as proportion is concerned, with the landscape, the architecture, space, and sky. And I think all of those things come together to have us be a little off our normal footing.
Yeah, it definitely, the psychedelic aspect helps with that. It gets you a little unmoored, it's in a way, looking at these things at this particular moment in time certainly speaks to our sense of maybe having lost a grip on reality, or what reality is reality. And we're all a little, floating, and we don't quite know where we're going with this. I have another question that just popped into my mind, and it's come to me before a few times looking at your work. I don't know if I would be asking you that question if I didn't know that you grew up in Massachusetts, but I wonder, almost as if like the familiar landscape of New England and the surroundings that you grew up in kind of come back in some of those familiar trees, mountains, houses that pop up in your paintings, but they get a surreal twist. It's almost like New England refracted through James Isherwood's vocabulary.
Very much so. This painting was made at a residency in Rhode Island in 2019. It was incepted in 2019. Took a couple of years to pull it together and make it what it is, but it is a coastal landscape for sure. And these connected buildings were elements in the actual landscape at this bird sanctuary in Middletown, Rhode Island. And very calming, very peaceful environment near the ocean. And I love the ocean. I grew up near the ocean, but not on it. I grew up in the woods. And all those things combine into the work and have been folded in as the years have advanced and the pictures have become more complicated. And this, it was a very satisfying thing to make, because it may be one of the more complex works that I've made in the last few years. And it sort of is a compendium of all the pictures that were made up until it.
Yes, it's like a little bit of everything in here.
Mhm.
And it takes a village. It literally takes a village. So this is the last one I think I have here, which but takes us back into outer space and the distribution wall. And also, there are on a regular basis, there are planets showing up. It's like, is it the moon? Is it the sun? Is it a planet? But, like Eastern Promise has it in it, and the New Understanding. What's the significance of the planet?
The the spatial objects, the moon, the sun, they could be interplayed basically between all the different works, but some of them are clearer than others. Most of the time it's the moon.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm interested in that shape and how to make it glow. This is one of my favorite recent paintings, which was completed in the last month and a half to make. It took me 2 years to make this painting. I know it sounds ridiculous, and it's tiny. It's 8 by 10 inches.
That's what I'm thinking. If I'm looking at the texture in the background, I was thinking this is not big.
It's very tiny, and it all came together in the last, I don't know, 10 days of its making, where all the elements came together. And it's a favorite because it's so odd to me. You have a pool right next to this structure. It's almost in the water.
It's in the water.
Got a little bit of edge, and it's reflecting something that cannot be seen as one of its major pictorial elements of this other ocean or lakescape, sunset, sunrise, with this giant blue silver moon. Mm-hmm. It's all iridescent silver liquid paint.
It's fascinating. The longer I look at this house, it's there and it's not there. It could be made out of glass. It could be made out of mirrors. It's reflecting something that we don't see that could be out there or that we could go into. So kind of there is this back and forth between different galaxies, spaces, realms that, you are inhabiting simultaneously while you look at this painting. And knowing that it's small is, again, to me, a confirmation as to how, yes, size matters, but size also doesn't matter. When a painting hits the right spot and it's worked out, it kind of doesn't almost matter what size it is. I mean, it speaks more about intimacy and scale, but this could be large, or your other ones could be small, and it wouldn't matter. I actually have to say I am the proud owner of a small Isherwood now, and I love it, but it was really interesting to me to see what happens when you take the image from the gallery to your own wall and looking at it, because even though it is so small, it has such an enormous holding power that the worlds it opens up, and this does the same thing. I feel it's mind-boggling, and it really amazes me every day I look at it what a presence this has. So your work is really stunning that way.
Thank you.
I want to go back to the reflecting pools for a hot second, especially if I look at the New Understandings first. The reflecting pools, A, why the reflecting pools, but B, it's fascinating also because the reflecting pools do a lot of things, but sometimes they don't reflect anything. Sometimes they reflect the landscape behind it. Sometimes they reflect something that isn't there. And sometimes they do. What got you into the reflecting pools?
The challenge of adding another spatial dimension, yes, and not thinking about actual physical space, not celestial space, but that also has crept in as well in coastal stations the whole ocean before those buildings is completely filled with stars.
Right.
So it was another challenge, one that I've continued to mine as subject matter and challenge to contrast with what it's reflecting. The movement of things in certain pieces is very basic and not so directly a copy of moving water. And that also was another challenge. How to throw myself off and the viewer off to try to make sense as to what we're looking at and why is it truthful in this one and not true in this picture.
Mm-hmm.
That comparison and where there's no clear answer from picture to picture is a challenge for the viewer to grapple with what's there. And I think it has to do with time, mostly. The way time changes things and how moments, frozen moments in these paintings are time unto themselves. Let's say just the pool aspect of something, or just the reflection of one facet of a structure.
Yeah, it's interesting you say the thing about the frozen moment, because oftentimes when I was looking through your work, I felt like there was something precise, mathematical, and at the same time surreal and not real, but it's like a screenshot. It's like a screenshot of something that freezes one particular moment, but there are so many openings to other worlds that indicate movement to different dimensions and different spheres. You have definitely given us a lot to think about, James, and I hope I didn't ask too many questions. We've been talking for a while. I think this might be a good point to come to an end, but I'm not going to stop before I ask you, what's next? What dimension are we going into next, James?
I can't reveal all the secrets, but things are moving forward.
Expect you to.
Thank you, Karin.
Thank you so much for speaking with me today. I'm looking forward to sharing this video with many. Thank you so much. You have a good day.
Thank you. You as well. Bye-bye.